good jokes we can tell.
Good morning, friends. Thank you so much for having me and welcoming me and also being very patient with me this morning. We're going to talk about stories today, but I'm going to give you a little context on why we're going to talk about stories. So I do love basketball a lot, and there's nothing I love more than Quaker basketball, which is always interesting. So I work at New Garden Friends School, and we are the regional champions this year. We did lose on Friday night. So we're not going into too far into states. But we were number 1 seed, and it was really exciting. We had a really young team, and they're the Bears, right? We're the Bears, and I love them dearly. But what happens is we spend all day, and we're like, peace and kindness, and right? And then we put them on the basketball court, and
the bear comes out.
It's a lot different. Thankfully, our team is very centered, I would say, and they do a really good job. But that doesn't always mean the other people do a really good job. So we were playing a different school on Thursday night, and a parent was very upset. So this was the first championship game. We were winning drastically. And that was going to happen. We were the number 1 seed. They were way back. You know, they do that at the beginning to knock them out. And the dad was very mad. It was his son's, I guess, last game ever in high school, and he wasn't very happy. He ended up getting ejected from the game, which doesn't happen at New Garden, right? Like, we just take care of the people. They're usually happy, and it's fine. We didn't even really know the protocol. We're like, our doors are unlocked. Like, we don't know what to do. But there was a younger student from lower campus who was there, and I had been hanging out with her all day. She helped me a bit with setting up concessions, which I help with, and she reacted very in the moment towards this man. So he got up, he starts yelling. We're not used to some of that type conflict, right? We're used to a little more quieter conflict, I think. And so she reacted. She was very upset. So she stood up in the stands. This is someone from, lower campus. She's a young one. And she's like, why are you here? Why are you yelling, right? And she starts yelling back. Well, everybody in the stands looks at her and we're like, hey, we don't do that. Like, we don't do that. It embarrassed her really badly. So she comes back to the concessions where I'm, working, and she's sobbing, and she's like, they said I wasn't a good Quaker.
Oh.
Broke her heart. And I was like, no, don't you let them tell you that. I was like, Quakers love to fight. And she looked at me, and she was like, I get sent to centering at school. No, we don't love to fight. Like, what are you talking about? So here I am trying to get her to stop crying, right? I give her the candy because I'm like, you gotta pull it back together. And then we start talking about it. And I'm like, well, honestly, sometimes you sit and wait for the spirit, and sometimes the spirit hits you. You do nothing about it. She was like, well, that was out of pocket was the word she kept using. I was like, it was. You should work on maybe your reactions. But, don't let somebody tell you you're not a good Quaker because you spoke. Quakers are supposed to speak. It's like, what if we didn't speak in all the injustice in America with Civil War and slavery? And what if we didn't speak in the 60s? And what if we don't speak right now? She looked at me and she was like, what are you talking about? So I start telling her about how, the court case that was filed and what some Quakers are doing in America right now. And she was like, I'm a pretty good Quaker. I was like, yeah, well, we're still going to talk to your mom afterwards. This is a lot, right? But it started getting me thinking, and I was like, I've had a really hard winter with my health and also just my spirit. And so in preparing for this message, I was like, I don't really know what to say. I want to be quiet. I just want to sit. And sometimes that's not helpful. And I just feel like the world is so loud right now. I was trying to eat a salad yesterday at lunch with my friends, and the local news was on. And I was like, I can't even watch the local news. It was about like the gun laws and how that's going to affect things. And I was like, right, it's just so loud. So I started thinking, if I, who am very talkative, outgoing, I love talking, if I'm struggling to speak, we're struggling to speak. Our spirits are struggling. And so inspired by her standing up and yelling back, I was like, well, let me dig a little deeper into this. So I started doing some research on stories. My roommate over at Wake Forest is an English major. She was teasing me. She was like, you're in history. You don't do this. But I do. I love stories. Yeah. It's one big goodness. So I started doing research on how many types of narratives that there are. In 2016, the Math and Science and Statistics Department from University of Vermont and the University of Adelaide, which is in Australia, came together and decided they were going to nail down how many stories there are in the world. Okay. So they used a computer program and ran all of the stories through it to try to get stats. Now, I'm not a very stats person. I'm not a math person to start with. The stats are really hard. But I was like, okay, I'm going to read this because this is interesting. So they come up with 7. They say there are 7 basic plots. There's not a single historian, social sciences, English, nobody but the stats people did this, which I think is very interesting. So they were really trying to look just at the numbers, not, oh, I read that one story one time. Like, no. So they used Project Gutenberg, if anybody's familiar, which has all of those already online, and ran them through. And they came up with 7. So we're going to go through them. The first one is overcoming the monster. Very much like the Odyssey, right? Like there's some big entity, or like Harry Potter, right? There's some scary thing, and we're going to fight it. And we're going to overcome it. Beowulf is one of the first stories, and I think that's why it's number 1 on here. Second is Rags to Riches, also a classic. So the Cinderella story, or the Great Gatsby story, where we've got somebody, and they affect it differently. The story can go different ways, but we start out with nothing, and we get rich.
Dick Whittington.
Yes. I love all these examples. I was trying to come up with more last night. It was so fun. So The Quest. This is one of my favorite types of stories, because I love The Hobbit. But like Finding Nemo too, right? Like we're on this journey and we're on the quest, and the story is the quest. Okay. Similarly, number 4 they say is Voyage and Return. Now, I think these are very similar, but they're trying to say that there's a difference in the story being the quest and the story being we go somewhere, we learn something, and then we come back home. So an example being like Alice in Wonderland or The Wizard of Oz, where someone falls down the rabbit hole or goes into Oz, and then they come back different. Next is rebirth, or this can also be a positive or a negative. So it can be rebirth like The Grinch or The Breakfast Club, where we like grow and change. Or it can be like an origin story for a villain, right? Marvel does this all the time. They give us a story and they're like, a great person experiences something and now they're the villain that you know. Rebirth can go either way. Then we have comedy for number 6. I think I'm least familiar with this one, which might speak to my not funniness in life. I was like, what is a comedy? I was like, what in the world? I put Ferris Bueller's Day Off because I always get called that because my name is Beulah and Bueller, and so. And then lastly is tragedy. So Romeo and Juliet. I put Bridge to Terabithia because that movie tore me up as a child. So we have these 7. And according to these stats, that's it. Okay? That's all there is. And I'm like, okay, that can't be right. Like, I'm going to write a story nobody's ever written. Like, that can't be right? And then I started thinking, well, if we're still narrowing it down, I wonder when the first time was we tried to narrow it down. Like, boxing in our stories. So, I found this guy. His name is Foster Harris. And in 1959, he was the first one to ever list how many stories existed. Okay? And first one, I guess, in English. I was only studying in America. So he lived in Oklahoma, and he worked at the University of Oklahoma set up the professional writing, like, department, because he wrote articles and short stories and, like, published. So he didn't write a lot of books. Later in his life, he did write 2 that were, like, teaching you to write, but he wasn't, like, a big author. But he said there's only 3. He says happy endings, unhappy endings, and tragedies. That's it. I'm like, okay, well, you're not wrong, but this is very simple. Like, these are so, what about my story? What about all the stories that I've heard in life? Like, I just don't know. Then I started thinking, what about stories in the Bible? I did find it interesting that every story I came to in the scripture, I was like, well, that fits in one of the 7. Like, it's either happy or it's not happy or it's voyage, I was like, rebirth, like, gosh, there's a lot of those stories, going through. But this had me reaffirming what I thought I would find, which is that we're trying to name how many stories there are, list them, turn it into stats, turn it into math. It's not, we're people. We change, our stories change, and like no matter how many stats we calculate, that was in 2016. What if somebody's written a story since 2016? What are we going to do if AI writes a story and it's different? Like, I don't know. Like, what are we going to do if we get 8 or 9 or 10? So I started thinking about how do we define them? How do we find our themes? How do we find our stories? And if people are changing and research is changing, then our stories are changing, right? So anybody, I know we all have to read stuff when we're in school that we're like, this isn't what I want to read, right? I have a dear friend whose little siblings in high school and they're reading Great Expectations. They were like, what is this? And I was like, well, in that time, this was a huge deal. Like, they were like, I'm going to read the new Hunger Games. I'm not reading this. So they reflect our times. Back to feeling silent, feeling like there's not much to say that could make any difference. For me, and this is where we turn to trying to answer the question in my heart of, Beulah, why can't you stand up and yell in the stands and say, this is not right. This is not right. What do we do? So my question kind of comes to what story is on our hearts? What story is written in our hearts? Whether it's our own stories or whether it's the testimony that lives within us, like the light, like what is written there. So that reminded me of my not so good buddy Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 3. And I'm going to read kind of the whole beginning section, but it's really verse 2 and verse 3. So he is trying to express to them that they don't have to write letters like he writes letters because they're written on his heart. I don't really know if his point came through, but I really love the way he words it. So it says, are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Surely we do not need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you, do we? He almost sounds salty. He's like, you want a recommendation from me? You want one for you? Like, we don't need that. And then he says, you yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, to be known and read by all. This is the inspiration for Quaker Living Letters, if you did not know. This is the verse where that comes from. And you show that you are a letter of Christ, prepared by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, just remember, not on stone, not on research, but on tablets of human hearts. So the first part of the answer is, well, our stories are in our hearts, right? And as Quakers, we spend so much time intentionally carving out space to hear people's voices, children's voices, each other's voices, communities we don't even know yet. But what are we going to do with that space if it's so loud in the world and so discouraging that we don't even know how to share our own stories? So I'm going to take us back to Proverbs. So we're going to jump all the way back. We're going to go to Proverbs 18. This is one of my favorite chapters in Proverbs. So if you're not familiar, you can read the whole thing. It's quite fun. But I'm going to read verse 17. So it says, and you know how Proverbs says little bits. So it's right there in the middle, just stuck in. It says, the one who first states a case seems right until the other comes and cross-examines. So in my long winter of not being so healthy, I've watched a lot of Law & Order Special Victims Unit. A lot.
Here I am.
A lot. Okay, like I've almost finished it. And what I love about that show is it's not focused on the violence or the running down the streets or what's happening. It's focused on sitting in the courtroom and figuring out the real story. And I love it. I love to watch it. I love the different lawyers and the different DAs and what they're doing. And there's two sides of every story. But there's really more than two sides. There's not just the victim, and there's not just the person who did the thing. There's all the people and all of their stories, and there's lies, and there's the truth. And so when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, this is why we have to speak, right? Like, if the world is a courtroom, which it's not, but if it is, all of these loud voices telling us what is right, what is Christian, sometimes even what is Quaker, what we're supposed to do, if we don't speak, then it's going to seem right. If the only voices are those that say Christ doesn't love people that don't have a legal residence here, it's going to sound right. There's nobody saying it. There's nobody pushing back. So the one who first states a case seems right until the other comes and cross-examines. A little farther down, In 21, it says, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat of its fruits. And the very last, so I don't read you the whole chapter, in 24, it says, some friends play at friendship, but a true friend sticks closer than the nearest kin, or in the older translations, as a brother. So friendship is quite literally based on speaking, right? It's hard to have a friend if you don't talk. If you've tried to be my friend in the past months, you know that. It's hard. It's hard. So we need to speak. So now we know, well, it's written in our hearts, so we know where the story comes from. And now we know, okay, if we don't speak up, the other side seems right? Especially spiritually. I don't mean other side like in a binary, but in the spiritualness of when someone's speaking and they're the only voice you can hear. Now, there's a word that I think challenges me more than any other word in the whole world of spirituality, and it is hope. Does anybody ever feel very challenged by that word? It gets me every time. So this is our last scripture. I have the 3. So in 1 Peter, chapter 3, we're going to read verse 15 and 16. But in this chapter, in this section, my Bible says it's suffering for doing right. That's the section. And it talks a lot about when you are being unjustly persecuted or you're doing the right thing and now you're being punished. But I want to read verse 15 and 16. It says, but in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence. I'm going to read it again in a minute, but I'm going to talk for a second. So, how do we share our stories? I struggle with gentleness and reverence, just like my student the other night, right? And so I think that is the challenge for me wanting to be quiet, is I want to be heard in a righteous way, and I'm afraid that my anger is what's going to come through. And that's just going to make it worse. Gentleness and reverence. How do I speak? How do we speak as a community, as individuals? How do we speak with reverence and gentleness? Even when I'm gentle, I've still got that anger. I'm still like, oh, even when I'm trying to be gentle. I think back to you at the beginning saying, hearing the Lord's voice. Did you hear God's voice? It will always be with reverence and gentleness. So, if we connect Corinthians to 1 Peter, we have, in our hearts is written our stories. The letter of truth is in our hearts. And then what is in our hearts? The hope. It says that if we sanctify Christ as Lord and are always ready to make a defense to anyone who demands of you, of the hope that is within you. It doesn't say he's trying to convince us there's hope in us. It says there is hope in you. I went to the book fair yesterday for the first time. Still new to Winston. It was a great experience. But when I gave him my last name to sign up, he said, I know that. And my family for many, many years, since the 70s, has owned a Christian bookstore. And they're very well known for their theology and doctrine. And he was like, what are you doing here? And I was like, oh, I wanted this book on hieroglyphics that is right here. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm just here. And I had a really long conversation with him. He had gone to Bible school, and, you know, he's telling me how he picks what he puts in there. And I'm like, oh, I saw your Max Lucado book, and we're talking. And, you know, it reminded me, I already knew that this was the verse I was going to end with, but it reminded me, you never know when you'll be asked to give that defense. In the King James Version, which I grew up reading, it says, be always ready to give an answer to the faith that is within you. Also powerful. But giving an answer to the faith is a lot easier than giving an answer to the hope. And as I think, I don't want to be tied to these 7 stories. I don't want us to be tied to these happy ending, sad ending, tragedy. What? Like, no. Even in this room, we have so many stories. And so my hope and my, I guess, prayer, the message I wanted to bring is we have hope in us. And if we don't share that and speak that, then we're just as limited as those lists and mathematics and statistics trying to say how many stories exist. So in our hearts, we can speak. And it might take us a lifetime to learn how to speak with gentleness and reverence. But our stories are the only thing that are going to bring truth when all we hear is the loud, loud noise of not just the world, but especially America right now. So I hope that meant a little something. And I'm going to sit now.
Thank you.
Thank you.